My name is Iris Vane. I'm 41 years old, and the afternoon my stepmother handed me a single-dollar bill at my father's estate reading and told me that was all he had left me. The family attorney was already reaching into his briefcase for a second envelope. She did not know about the second envelope. Nobody in that room knew about it except Gerald Watts, who had been my father's attorney for 31 years, who had drafted the document inside it, and who had been instructed by my father in writing to present it only after the primary will had been read in full, to let Gloria finish, to let the room hear what she had arranged, and then to open the second envelope and say what my father had actually done with the thing that mattered most. Gloria had spent 3 years carefully rewriting the story of my father's estate. She had moved accounts, restructured holdings, and replaced the attorney who had handled my father's affairs for 2 decades with a younger man who had drafted a new will 18 months before my father died, a will that left the family home, the investment accounts, and the lake property in Franklin County to Gloria and her daughter Tara in equal parts, and left me, my father's only biological child, the contents of his wallet, $1. Robert Vane's last dollar, Gloria said, pressing it into my palm at the reading with the expression of a woman performing grief while conducting a transaction. She said he had always said, I was the strong one, that I didn't need much, that he was proud of how independent I had turned out. She had rehearsed that line. I could tell by the smoothness of it, the way it landed with the exact weight of something prepared in advance for an audience. What she had not prepared for was Gerald Watts. Welcome back to Silent Daughter Stories, where quiet people finally tell the truth. If someone has ever handed you a performance of your own erasure and called it your father's wishes, this story is for you. Subscribe, drop a comment, and let me take you back to Franklin County, Virginia, and the afternoon my father walked out of a coffee shop and told me something he had never told my stepmother. I want to start with my father, because everything in this story comes from who he actually was, and keeping that clear is the only way the ending makes sense. Robert Vane was 67 years old when he died, a retired civil engineer who had spent 40 years building bridges in Western Virginia and had the particular quality of a man who believed that the most important structures were the ones that held weight quietly. He did not perform love. He expressed it in the way of men of his generation and temperament, in showing up, in practical action, in the careful management of things that mattered. He had been a good father to me. I want to say that clearly because this is not a story about an absent father or a neglectful one. He was present. He called every Sunday. He drove 6 hours to see me perform in my school's History Bowl competition when I was 14 and stood in the gymnasium in his good coat and clapped louder than anyone else. He was not a man who said, I love you easily, but he was a man who drove 6 hours. He met Gloria when I was 23. I was already out of the house and into my first teaching job, and the meeting was not the devastating childhood disruption it is for some people. It was simply the introduction of a new person into a life that had already taken its shape. Gloria was 50 at the time, twice divorced, with a daughter named Tara who was 21, and had the particular energy of a young woman who has learned, from early exposure to her mother's survival strategies, how to read a room and position herself in it. I did not dislike Gloria immediately. I want to be accurate about this, because accuracy is what I teach and what I believe in. She was warm to me in the early years, warmer than she needed to be, and I attributed this to the genuine effort that some step-parents make. It took me several years to understand that the warmth was not effort, but investment, that she was managing me the way you manage a variable in a plan you are still developing. My father married her when I was 25. I stood at the small ceremony in the Franklin County Courthouse and felt the complicated mixture of genuine happiness for him and the low, unnamed unease of a person who has noticed something they cannot yet name. Unnamed thing was the way Gloria looked at the house, my father's house, The house where I had grown up, that he had owned free and clear for 20 years, that sat on 3 acres at the edge of the county with a view of the Blue Ridge that my mother had chosen when they bought the land in 1985. Gloria looked at it the way you look at a thing you have already decided belongs to you. I noticed, and I said nothing, and I went back to my classroom and my students and my Sunday phone calls, and for 6 years everything was ordinary on the surface, and underneath the surface, something was being rearranged, slowly and carefully, by a woman who understood that patience was the most reliable tool available to her. My father called me on a Tuesday in April, 14 months before he died. He asked if I could come to Franklin County that weekend, not for any occasion, just to have coffee. He said it in the tone he used when something had been sitting with him long enough that it needed to be said out loud, the tone I had learned to recognize over 41 years as the signal that what came next was going to be important. I drove down on a Saturday morning. We met at the diner on Main Street, the one he had been going to since before I was born, where the coffee came in ceramic mugs and the booths had vinyl upholstery gone soft with decades of use. He was already there when I arrived, with his coffee and the newspaper and the particular stillness of a man who has been thinking about what he wants to say and has decided how to say it. He waited until the coffee came. Then he told me that he had been diagnosed with a cardiac condition 18 months earlier, and that the prognosis was not good, and that he had perhaps a year, perhaps 2, and that he had been thinking about what he needed to do with that time. I held my coffee mug and looked at him and felt the floor go out from underneath the ordinary Saturday morning. He had not told Gloria the full prognosis. He had told her he was being monitored, that things were manageable, that there was no need to worry. He had done this, he told me, because he had been watching Gloria watch the estate for 6 years, and he needed time to do what he needed to do before she understood the timeline. "I've been to see Gerald Watts," he said. Gerald Watts had been my father's attorney since before I was born, a man who had drafted my parents' original wills, who had handled the estate when my mother died, who had witnessed my father's marriage to Gloria and had apparently been watching the subsequent years with the quiet attentiveness of a man who had seen this particular story before in his 40 years of practice. Gloria had me use a different attorney for the new will, my father said, a young man named Clifford. She said Gerald was getting too old, that it was time to update things. I let her because I was tired and I didn't want to fight about it. He paused. That was a mistake. I waited. The new will gives her everything. The house, the accounts, the lake property. Your share is... He stopped. Symbolic, I said. She wanted a number in it. Something she could point to if questioned. Something that looked like provision without being provision. He looked at his coffee. "I'm sorry, Iris. I should have paid more attention to what I was signing. She was very careful about when she brought things to me. He had been signing documents in the last months of a cardiac illness, during a period when his energy was managed and his attention was rationed, and Gloria had known exactly when to present paperwork and how to frame it, and how to make the signing feel like a routine matter rather than a significant one. I had seen this pattern before. In history, in the unequal distribution of estates across generations, in the specific mechanics of how power transfers from the people who built things to the people who position themselves beside the builders. I had taught it to 16-year-olds. I had not seen it in my own family. Gerald and I have been working on something, my father said, for the last 4 months, quietly. There's a second document. It won't touch the will. I can't contest my own will without making her aware, and I don't have the energy for the fight." He paused. "But there's a trust, irrevocable, established before the new will was drafted, which means it predates her claim on those specific assets and sits outside the estate entirely." I sat very still. Gerald has the documents. He has instructions. He won't present them at the reading until after Gloria has finished. My father looked at me across the diner table with the expression I had seen on his face only a few times in my life, the expression of a man who is settling an account. I need you to let her have her moment. I need you to sit through it. Can you do that? I thought about the silver dollar in his coat pocket. The Morgan dollar he had carried since before I was born, a habit he had developed from his own father, the warm weight of it in his hand when a decision needed steadying. Yes, I said, I can do that. He reached into his pocket and put the coin on the table between us. When it's done, he said, I want you to have this. It's the most honest thing I own. I picked it up. The silver was warm from his pocket. I have carried it every day since. I want to give you the shape of those 3 years between Gloria's arrival at the estate and my father's death, because the shape of them is the architecture of what she built and what he dismantled. The first year of their marriage had been, from my perspective, unremarkable. Gloria managed the house with genuine competence. She cooked well and kept things in order and was present for my father in the practical ways that his work-focused life had taught him to need. I came for holidays and observed and felt the unnamed unease, but had no evidence to attach it to, and no language for the thing I was watching. The second year was when the attorney changed. My father mentioned it almost in passing on a Sunday call, that Gloria had suggested they update their estate documents with a newer practice, that Gerald Watts was getting on in years, that it made sense to have someone current. He said it without emphasis, the way you mention a routine administrative decision. I heard it with the low, faint register of the thing I had been unable to name, and I said nothing because I had no grounds to say anything and because he was not asking my opinion. The third year was when the documents were signed. I did not know this at the time. I only understood it retroactively from the diner table, from my father's voice saying she was very careful about when she brought things to me. The cardiac symptoms had been managed and medicated and exhausting, and there had been days and weeks when his concentration was partial and his energy was rationed, and Gloria had understood the architecture of his diminished capacity, the way a structural engineer understands a load-bearing wall. Precisely, and with full knowledge of what it would take to move it. She had moved it. She had brought documents at the right moments, framed them in the right language, presented them as routine updates and not as the redistribution of 30 years of a man's careful accumulation. And my father, who was tired and medicated and trusted the woman beside him in the particular way of a man who does not want to believe that trust has been misplaced, had signed. He had not understood what he had signed until 3 months later, when he felt well enough to read it carefully. And then he had called Gerald Watts. I want to tell you about Gerald Watts because he is as much a part of this story as my father. He was 74 at the time of the reading. He had been practicing in Franklin County for 41 years, the same practice my father had walked into in 1984 to draft his first will with my mother. He had buried my mother's estate, had witnessed my parents' happiest documents and their saddest ones, and had been watching Gloria from the moment she entered the picture with the patient attentiveness of a man who had seen this particular pattern before, and understood that the only thing you could do about it was be ready when it needed to be addressed. When my father called him, Gerald had said, "I was hoping you'd call." They had met in Gerald's office on 6 separate occasions over 4 months. My father had brought the documents he had signed. Gerald had read them with the care of a man examining a structure he already knows is compromised. He had explained what they meant. He had explained what could and could not be done in the time available. He had also explained what could be done with the one asset that predated the marriage entirely, the original land parcel. The 3 acres my mother had chosen in 1985, which had sat in my father's sole name since her death, and had never been commingled with the marital accounts, and which was, in Gerald's professional opinion, cleanly and legally transferable into a trust that would sit entirely outside the estate. "The will is hers," Gerald had told my father. "You signed it and you had capacity, and she'll argue it holds. But this land is yours in a way that predates her claim, and what you do with it before you die is your business. My father had done his business. He had done it over 4 months quietly in a way that cost him significant energy in a year when energy was rationed, because he had decided that there was one thing worth spending what he had left on, and that thing was making certain that his daughter was not going to stand in a room and watch her father's life distributed around her without recourse. He'd not told me about the trust until the diner table, 14 months before he died, because he had needed to be certain the document was clean before he said a word. He was an engineer. He did not announce a bridge before it was load tested. When he was certain, he told me, and he put the silver dollar on the table between us. Drop silver dollar in the comments if you already understand what my father was doing at that diner table. And subscribe right now, because the afternoon of the estate reading is the part of this story that my stepmother will not forget for the rest of her life. My father died on a Wednesday morning in June. He died at home, which was what he had asked for, with hospice care that Gloria had arranged with the particular efficiency of a woman managing a timeline. I drove down the same day and sat with him for the last hours, and he held my hand and did not say much because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said at a diner table on a Saturday morning with ceramic coffee mugs and a silver dollar between us. The estate reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral. 3 weeks of settling, of sorting, of Gloria moving through the house with the focused attention of a woman taking stock of what was now hers. She was not openly cruel to me during those weeks. She was managed, carefully, precisely warm, the warmth of a woman who understood that the document was not yet final, and the attorney was not yet present, and the room was not yet ready. Tara was there most days, helping Gloria catalog and sort. Tara was 34 and had her mother's gift for positioning. She was always in the right place in any room, always just adjacent to the person who held something she needed, always warm in the specific way that costs nothing and accomplishes everything. I came when I could. I helped where I was allowed. I said what needed to be said and held the silver dollar in my coat pocket and waited. The morning of the reading, I called Gerald Watts. "Everything is in order," he said, in the measured voice of a man who has been doing this work for 40 years and has learned that reassurance is a form of precision. "I'll see you at 2. "Thank you, Gerald." A pause. "Your father was a good man," he said. He thought about this very carefully. "I know he did. He wanted you to know that the dollar, the one Gloria is going to hand you, was not his idea." Another pause. "He wanted you to know that he knew." I held the silver dollar in my palm. "I know he knew," I said. "I want to tell you what the 3 weeks between my father's death and the estate reading were like, because they were a specific kind of endurance, and I think honesty requires describing them. Gloria ran the house in those weeks with the focused efficiency of a woman in transition. She sorted and cataloged and made decisions about what would stay and what would go with the authority of a person who already understood the outcome of the process she was managing. She was not openly cruel. She was managed. That word keeps returning because it is the most accurate one, the specific quality of a warmth that is strategic rather than felt. There were moments she asked for my help. I helped. I packed boxes and labeled things and sat with my father's books for an afternoon because the books were the clearest record of who he had been, and I was not ready to see them distributed before I had sat with them. Gloria let me take a few. She was generous about the books. I'll give her that. The books were not the thing she was keeping. There were moments Tara watched me from across rooms with her mother's gift for reading, a situation. I was not a threat in those weeks, or so she understood it. I was the biological daughter with the symbolic bequest, and there was nothing I could do about that in 3 weeks before a reading. And Tara had been raised inside a story where I was a minor figure, and she had never been given reason to revise it. I let them both believe what they believed. I kept the silver dollar in my coat pocket. I called Gerald twice, once to confirm the date, once to confirm the logistics. Both times he said what he needed to say in very few words, which is the communication style of a man who has learned that precision requires economy. On the morning of the reading, I ironed the black dress I had brought. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table of the house I had grown up in, which was technically already not mine, and I held the silver dollar in my palm and thought about my father's voice at the diner table, saying, "I need you to let her have her moment." I had done many difficult things in my life. I had taught other people's children about the history of dispossession and redistribution, and the mechanisms by which the powerful take from the less powerful and call it order. I had graded papers on these subjects for 16 years and believed in the importance of the telling. This was the morning I understood it from the inside. I put the silver dollar in my coat pocket. I drove to the attorney's office. I let her have her moment. The estate reading was held at Gloria's attorney's office, Clifford's office, the young man who had drafted the new will. It was a glass and chrome building on the main road outside town, the kind of office that signals recent success without the patina of history. Gerald Watts arrived separately, at 2 on the dot, in the good dark suit he had been wearing to estate readings for 30 years. He set his briefcase beside his chair and nodded at me and said nothing more. Gloria arrived with Tara and 2 of her sisters, because Gloria understood that an audience is a form of resource, and she had assembled one. She wore a black dress and the particular expression of a woman who is grieving publicly and conducting business simultaneously, and has had enough practice at both to do them at once without visible effort. Clifford read the will. I will not give you the full recitation because the full recitation was designed to be humiliating, and I do not need to reproduce it in order to tell you what was in it. The house to Gloria and Tara in equal parts. The investment accounts, now 4 of them, representing 30 years of my father's careful saving, to Gloria outright. The lake property to Gloria, with a provision allowing Tara's children the right of use, a bequest to the local Rotary Club, a bequest to the church, and then, to my daughter Iris, $1, being a token of my love and my confidence in her independence and strength. Gloria reached into her handbag and removed a folded dollar bill. She stood and crossed the room and pressed it into my palm with both hands, the gesture of a woman performing sorrow, and she said the line she had rehearsed. "Your father always said you were the strong one. You don't need much. He was so proud of how independent you turned out." The room was very quiet. Gloria's sisters were looking at me with the careful sympathy of women who have been briefed on the situation and have decided which side of it they are on. Tara was looking at her phone, which I noted and which told me something about her confidence in the outcome. I held the dollar in my palm. I looked at Gloria, and I did not say anything, because my father had asked me to let her have her moment, and the only thing I had ever been truly unable to do was refuse my father a reasonable request. She returned to her seat. Clifford shuffled his papers. There was the brief, settling silence of a room that believes the business is concluded. Then Gerald Watts opened his briefcase. He did it without announcement, without drama, without preamble. He simply reached in and removed a sealed envelope and set it on the table in front of him, and the sound of it, the small, flat sound of an envelope placed on a conference table, was loud enough in that particular silence to turn every head in the room. On the front of the envelope, in my father's handwriting, 3 words, "For Iris, only." Gloria's face did something I had been watching for without knowing I was watching for it. Not a collapse, not a scene. Something quieter and more revealing. A single moment of absolute stillness. The stillness of a person who has been running a very long calculation and has just understood that one of the variables was wrong. "What is that?" she said. "This," Gerald said, in the measured voice of a man who has been doing this work for 40 years, "is a document your husband asked me to hold and present separately from the primary estate. That's not—" Gloria looked at Clifford. "That's not part of the estate." "No," Gerald said, "it isn't. That's rather the point." He looked at me. "May I?" I nodded. He opened the envelope. "I want to tell you about the reading itself in more detail because the 40 minutes between Clifford beginning and Gerald opening his briefcase were 40 of the most instructive minutes of my life, and I think they are worth describing precisely." Gloria had arranged the seating. I sat at the far end of the conference table, which was a long table in a room with good light and the smell of new carpet. And Gloria sat at the head of it because she had booked the room and it was her attorney's office, and she understood the symbolic weight of placement. Tara sat to her right. Gloria's two sisters sat across from me, with the careful sympathy of women who have been told a version of a story and have decided to receive it. Gerald sat to my left, at the corner of the table, with his briefcase on the floor beside his chair. He did not speak during Clifford's reading. He sat with his hands folded and his expression the specific neutral of a man who is waiting for a cue. Clifford read in the measured, practiced voice of a professional delivering necessary information. The house, the accounts, the lake property, the Rotary Club, the church, the dollar. I listened to the dollar provision being read aloud, and I thought about every Sunday phone call for 41 years and the gymnasium in which my father had stood in his good coat. And I held very still, and I did not let anything move on my face except the ordinary composure of a woman who has been told to expect this and has prepared for it. Gloria rose when Clifford finished. She came to my end of the table. She pressed the dollar into my palm with both hands, as I have described, and she said the line she had rehearsed, and her sisters made the small sounds of women confirming a narrative, and Tara looked at her phone. I held the dollar. I looked at my stepmother. She was 58, and she had spent 3 years on a very careful plan, and she was standing at the end of it with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has navigated something complex and reached the conclusion she intended. She looked at me with warmth, the managed kind, the kind that costs nothing and means nothing and has never, not once in the time I have known her, been connected to anything true. I held the dollar. I did not speak. She returned to her seat, and Gerald Watts opened his briefcase. There is a sound that happens in a room when something that was expected to be concluded is revealed to still be in progress. It is not a loud sound. It is the sound of breath held and then adjusted and then held again, the sound of people recalculating without yet knowing what they are calculating toward. That was the sound in that room when Gerald set the envelope on the table. I want to describe Gloria's face in that moment because the description is part of the record. She did not go pale. She did not gasp. She went still, the specific stillness of a woman in whom every managed expression has suddenly run out of instruction because the situation has exceeded the script she prepared for it. I watched her understand, not immediately. Over the 30 seconds between Gerald setting down the envelope and him opening it, I watched the understanding arrive the way a tide arrives. Not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, filling the spaces between what she had planned and what was actually happening. "What is that?" she said. Gerald answered her. Clifford looked at the envelope. Tara looked up from her phone, and Gerald opened it. The document inside was the establishment of an irrevocable trust, drafted, executed, and funded 4 months before the new will was signed by my father under Gloria's management. The trust had been established with assets that predated my father's marriage to Gloria. The original land parcel my parents had purchased in 1985, which had been transferred from joint ownership to my father's sole name after my mother's death, and which had appreciated over 30 years to a current appraised value of $247,000. The trust named me as sole beneficiary. It named Gerald Watts as trustee, with instructions to distribute the principal to me within 60 days of my father's death. Because the trust was irrevocable and predated the new will and had been funded with assets that had never been commingled with the marital estate, it was, as Gerald explained in the quiet, unhurried voice of a man reading from a document he had spent 4 months making, certain was airtight. Entirely outside Gloria's reach, she had rewritten the will. She had managed the accounts. She had positioned every asset she could see. She had not seen the land. My father had bought it with my mother before Gloria existed in his life, and he had transferred it 4 months before he died into a trust that had only one beneficiary and that could not be altered, amended, or contested by anyone who was not named in it. That land, Gloria said, and her voice had lost the managed warmth entirely. What was underneath it was something rawer. He never told me about a trust. No, Gerald said. He didn't. I want to contest it. You're welcome to consult an attorney, Gerald said, but I'll tell you what that attorney will tell you. This trust was established before the will was drafted. The assets were transferred legally and with full capacity. The document is clean and the funding is documented to the day. He paused. Your husband planned this carefully. He had 4 months to plan it, and he was a careful man. Gloria looked at me. I held the silver dollar in my coat pocket, the warm weight of it against my palm. I looked at her, and I thought about a diner table on a Saturday morning and my father's voice saying, I need you to let her have her moment in the 6 hours he had driven to watch me win a history bowl, and every Sunday phone call for 41 years, and the word only written on the front of an envelope in a dead man's handwriting. I did not say anything. I did not need to. The document said everything my father had needed to say in a room where his voice was no longer available. Here's what happened after. I want to add something about my father's engineering, because it is relevant and because I am a history teacher, and I believe context is the difference between a fact and a truth. My father spent 40 years building bridges in Western Virginia. Not large bridges, not the suspension bridges that appear in photographs, not the landmarks. He built the ordinary ones, the ones that carry county roads over creeks and drainage channels and the small rivers that run through the valley. The bridges that nobody names and everybody uses and that have to hold weight in all weather for 50 years without anyone thinking about them. He used to say that the best engineering is invisible, that a structure which performs its function without drawing attention to itself has achieved something, that the bridges people notice are not necessarily the bridges that last. I thought about this at the diner table when he told me about the trust, about the irrevocable trust that predated the will that sat outside the estate, that had been funded and documented and placed exactly where it needed to be in the months before his capacity was further compromised. He had built a structure in secret, in the time he had, that would hold weight after he was gone, without requiring anyone to maintain it or defend it or argue for it. It was invisible until Gerald opened the envelope. Then it held. I thought about it again standing on the 3 acres in August, looking at the Blue Ridge in the long, late light. 3 acres that my mother had chosen when she was young and alive and did not yet know she would be gone by 52, that my father had kept for 30 years in the quiet, habitual way of a man who holds on to the things that matter without making a performance of the holding. He had held on. He had held on through a second marriage and a new will and 3 years of a woman moving the pieces of his estate. And at the end, in the 4 months when he finally understood what was happening and had the energy to do one last thing about it, he had called Gerald Watts and built one last structure. Invisible, load-bearing, clean. For me. A bridge, Mother had started and my father had finished, in the last months of his life, for the daughter who had inherited his preference for structures that hold weight without drawing attention to themselves. I stood on it on a Sunday afternoon in August and felt it hold. Gloria retained an attorney and explored her options for 3 months. The attorney told her what Gerald had told her, which was that the trust was clean and the challenge had no viable path, and she eventually withdrew. I know this because Gerald told me, with the dry satisfaction of a man for whom a clean document is its own form of justice. The land was distributed to me within 60 days. I did not sell it immediately. I drove out to it on a Sunday afternoon in August, the first time I had been there since I was a child, and I walked the 3 acres in the long, late summer light and looked at the Blue Ridge and felt my mother in the view she had chosen 40 years ago and my father in the care with which he had kept it all those years. Quietly, separately, out of reach of everyone except the daughter he had driven 6 hours for. I stood there for a long time. The silver dollar was in my coat pocket. I am still deciding what to do with the land. I am in no hurry. It has been waiting for me for 40 years, and it is not going anywhere. What I know is that it exists, that it is mine, and that my father spent 4 months of the last year of his life making certain that neither of those facts could be altered by anyone who had not earned them. Tara called me twice in the months after the reading. The first time, I did not answer. The second time, I did, because Tara was 21 when her mother married my father, and she had been raised inside a particular story about the world and about me, and I was not willing to make her the villain of a story where the villain was her mother's choices. She was awkward on the phone and said something about how she hoped we could have a relationship, and I said I hoped so too, and I meant it in the careful, limited way that you mean things when you are not yet sure what they are worth, but are not willing to close the door. We are not close. We may not get there. The door is open. Gloria and I have not spoken since the reading. I have not initiated contact, and she has not either, which is the arrangement that makes the most sense for 2 people who have nothing true left to say to each other. Gerald Watts retired the spring after the reading. He sent me a note, handwritten, brief, the way my father had always communicated things that mattered, that said only, "He was right about you. He always was." GW, I put it in the box where I keep the things that are entirely mine. I still teach history. I still stand in front of rooms of 16-year-olds and talk about how power transfers and what it costs and what it takes to hold on to what is yours when the people around you are working very hard to rewrite the story of what belongs to whom. My students sometimes ask why I care so much about primary sources, why I tell them over and over to go back to the original document, to the thing that was written at the time, to the version that predates the revision. I tell them that the original document is the one that holds, that the revisions come after, that the people who want to rewrite things will always try and will sometimes succeed and will never fully succeed, because the original record exists, was made with intention, was preserved by someone who understood its value, and cannot be altered by anyone who was not there when it was made. My father was a civil engineer. He built structures that hold weight quietly. He built one last one 4 months before he died in an attorney's office in Franklin County, Virginia, and he funded it with land my mother had chosen 40 years earlier, and he named it for me, and he put it outside the reach of everyone who had spent 3 years trying to decide what I was worth. He knew what I was worth. He always had. That's my story. $1 handed across a conference table, 1 envelope opened after, and a father who spent the last year of his life building something his daughter could stand on. If this reminded you that the people who love you leave records, that love with intention cannot be erased by the people who come after it, take that as your sign. Share this with someone who needed to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.